A slowdown is when something is still rising, but not rising as quickly. We assume it's still accelerating because our grandparents and great-grandparents lived through the most amazing changes. I began looking at data assuming I'd write a book about the half of human life that was speeding up and the half that was slowing down. And there were only a few things that were actually accelerating. There are 67 graphs in my book of Slowdown, of which 63 show slowing down. The reason I use these graphs is that because on a normal graph of change, it's very hard to see both the change and the rate of change, whereas the graphs I use emphasise the changing speed of change itself. These phase portrait graphs aren't normally used in social science. They're used by some physicists and a little bit in maths, but not very much. This is the kind of graph that is normally used to scare people into thinking everything is going to come to an end and it's all terrible. This is a graph of that same data. It's now drawn where the horizontal axis shows the rate of change, and on the vertical axis you can see the rising total number of people in the world, and you can see that we've slowed down. The absolute rate of change in world human population stopped increasing around the year 1990. In our grandchildren's lifetime, we will have the first ever stabilisation of the human species since it became a species. This slowdown is not because of pandemics, not because of wars, not because of colonialisation. This is because people, particularly women, are taking control of their own bodies. My book starts with a quote from South Korea, which is the first country in the world where on average people are having less than one child per couple, which means that in theory if there isn't immigration the population is going to halve in a single generation. We recently went through a very rare acceleration in our numbers as a species. Charles Darwin, in The Origin of Species, talked about how in 2 or 3 favourable seasons a species can balloon in their number. Now that was ironic because he was writing it just at the time when his own species worldwide was going through that acceleration, and I think he was actually writing about elephants. In the last 2 centuries, our global numbers went from 1 billion to 4 billion, now approaching 8 billion. It was accompanied by discovering uses for steam power, by innovation, by electricity. While population was increasing rapidly, markets every year were getting bigger. If you were Coca-Cola, you could simply sell to the same proportion of people as you sold to last year, and you become ever more profitable. As younger adult numbers decrease, however, as the number of people being born goes down, as the market shrinks, as people become more educated, doing what we had done before cannot work as it did before. We have seen growth as about being more productive, about making ever more stuff, ever faster. People were talking about the global economic slowdown to come long before the 2020 pandemic began. We tend to look for immediate explanations. We talk about the oil shock in the 1970s or unemployment in the 80s. We don't step back and say, actually, overall, GDP growth per capita has in general been slowing down for some time. We should be planning for a slowdown, as it's now clear that we're in that era. I first saw this in rural Japan, when I went to see forests that were no longer being managed, that were returning to the wild. Villages there, where nobody was young because the young people had gone to Tokyo. But you can see the same in Spanish villages and Italian villages. We haven't planned for slowing down, we haven't planned for the population actually falling, and we're going to have to begin to do that. We live in a world where people want to constantly talk about new inventions. I work in a university where our bread and butter is telling people to give us more money for our research and we will produce new and wonderful things. But just step back and think. The tractor was a huge innovation of only just over 100 years ago. The 747 first flew in 1968 and we're still flying them now. Concorde doesn't fly anymore. Last year it was claimed that the release of a new phone that you could bend was a great step forward. When it comes to technological innovation, we appear to be running out of new things to do. There have been attempts to measure the actual speed of innovation, but they find that the 1930s were the period of greatest innovation, when new uses were being found for electricity. When it comes to the internet and the connectivity we now have, well, I had email first in the 1980s. I saw video screening on computer screens in the late 1980s. It isn't incredibly new. The real shock was the telephone, and that came a long time ago. But we now don't expect to have such changes again. We don't expect to teleport, to physically move from one place to another in a way that we were promised if you ever watched Star Trek. Slowdown is not bad news, but we're going to have to get ready to live in a world in which a significant group of us do not constantly become ever richer than our parents. Your children are quite likely to be living in the same kind of house with the same kind of washing machine and tumble dryer and probably go on the same kind of holidays, if not being even a little bit more controlled about the amount of travel they do and the amount of carbon that they burn than you ever were. We worry about carbon because temperature is one of the few remaining accelerations. Here's a graph of the rising temperatures and the change in the rate of that rise. It is leaning the wrong way, it is still moving rightwards, so global temperature was not just increasing, but increasing by slightly more each year than the year before. This became absolutely obvious after 2009, which is why the climate skeptics mostly shut up. If you look at temperature rises on a graph like this, they don't rise very quickly in 1983, which was a year of global recession, or in 1990, or in 2008, or 2009. Global recessions are about the best thing that you can have for not increasing global temperatures. Conversely, pandemics, at least since 1665, have normally tended to have very small effects. In the 1918-1919 flu pandemic, there was a 14% drop in world GDP, but that rose by 16% the next year. The 1968-69 pandemic had almost no effect whatsoever on economic growth. However, this 2020 pandemic, a relatively small pandemic hopefully, has hit at a time when we were already decelerating, and that may matter greatly. The one great long-term threat to human beings that we are now well aware of is the threat caused by our ever-rising pollution. It can help to have one great thing to concentrate on. In the 1960s and 70s, that one thing to concentrate on was avoiding nuclear war. You can forget about everything else. It was the one thing, and we got rid of 90% of nuclear warheads after the 1980s. If we're beginning to see a slowdown in the rate of growth, then we can actually see that it is possible that we may be able to reduce our pollution and our great-grandchildren may not live a worse life than we live.